People love to say that a marriage built on hardship is somehow more honest than one built on comfort, that scraping by together proves something money never could. I used to believe that too. I believed it through 9 years of clipping coupons at the kitchen table, through hand-me-down winter coats for my son. Through the summer we didn't run the air conditioning because Thomas said the numbers just weren't there yet. I believed it right up until the afternoon. I sat across from a stranger in a glass office 40 floors above downtown Seattle and watched him push a folder toward me and tell me my dead husband had $61 million I never once knew existed. Welcome to Kate's Fortune Stories. It's Kate again, and I'm so happy you're here with me. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Don't forget to subscribe, because this story is only just beginning. My name is Laura Bennett. For 9 years I was married to Thomas Bennett, and for most of that time, I genuinely believed we were living paycheck to paycheck, counting down the days until the next one landed, never once suspecting there was an entire second life sitting untouched somewhere far away from our own. We lived in a narrow 2-story house in a working-class neighborhood outside Denver, Colorado, the kind of house with a dented gutter Thomas kept meaning to replace and a bathroom we never got around to fixing because, he always said, we had to stay careful. I taught high school biology at the school 6 blocks from our house. Thomas managed dispatch and route planning at Bennett Freight and Logistics, the trucking company his father had built from a single rig and that his younger brother Mark now ran day to day. On the outside, we looked like an ordinary family doing its best with what it had. And that was the story I told everyone, my sister, my co-workers, myself, on the nights I lay awake wondering why we never seemed to get further ahead, no matter how careful we were. It was, I would eventually understand, a story Thomas had constructed with a patience and precision that still leaves me a little breathless when I think about it. Looking back, there were signs. There are always signs. You simply don't want to see them while you're still living inside the version of the story they contradict. The first sign came about 18 months before Thomas died, at a birthday dinner at his mother Carol's house. His brother Mark made an offhand comment about Thomas being the one who never let a dollar slip through his fingers, joking that their father must have passed down all his caution to one son and none of it to the other. Thomas laughed along, easily enough, but I noticed his knuckles whiten slightly around his glass. Carol added, in the warm but pointed way she had of saying things, that it was lucky one of her boys had sense, considering how close Mark's spending habits had come to sinking him more than once. I filed the comment away the way you file away 100 small remarks over the course of a marriage, without weight, without suspicion. The second sign was quieter, and it took me longer to notice. Thomas kept an old black laptop locked inside a filing cabinet in our detached garage, not in the house, not anywhere near our shared home office. He told me it ran outdated dispatch software he liked to keep separate from anything personal. He said it lightly, almost automatically, the way people say something they've said to themselves so many times it no longer sounds rehearsed to them, even if it does to everyone else. I let it go, because Thomas wasn't a man prone to secrecy or drama. He was steady, careful, a little closed off, and those were exactly the qualities that had drawn me to him in the first place. The third sign, the one I return to most now, was money itself, or more precisely, the total absence of it from any real conversation between us. Thomas handled almost every financial decision alone. I had access to the account that covered groceries, the mortgage, and our son's after-school care, but everything beyond that, retirement contributions, insurance, taxes, belonged entirely to him. He said it was simpler that way. He said it with a small, reassuring smile that made it sound like generosity instead of what it actually was, which was a locked door I hadn't yet realized existed. We had a son, Jack, 6 years old when Thomas died, with his father's quiet watchfulness and my restless curiosity. For most of a short life, He heard some version of "we can't right now" more often than any child should. Birthday parties stayed small. Vacations meant weekend camping trips. Never flights, never hotel pools. When Jack asked for a bike with real gears for his 6th birthday, Thomas knelt down and gently told him money was tight that year, maybe next year. I stood in the doorway, hating the fact that my son was going without, certain we simply didn't have it to give. I had no idea that in a financial institution across the country, an account bearing my husband's name held more money than every bicycle shop in Colorado combined could ever sell in a lifetime. Thomas died on a Wednesday in late September, a sudden aneurysm at his desk at the dispatch office, 42 years old. I remember Mark's voice breaking on the phone in a register I had never once heard from him, and driving to the hospital so fast the roads barely registered. By the time I arrived, it was already over. I stood under fluorescent hospital lights holding Jack's hand, trying to find language a 6-year-old could survive, while a nurse gently asked whether I had someone who could help with the arrangements. I did not, in that moment, have any idea how completely my life was about to be rearranged, or how thoroughly the man I had spent 9 years beside had been living an entirely different life in parallel to the one I thought we shared. The funeral took place 6 days later. Carol Bennett organized most of it, and I let her, partly out of grief, partly because I genuinely wasn't certain we could cover more than the simplest arrangement. 2 days after Thomas died, I sat in the funeral home's front office scrolling our joint account balance on my phone, watching it hover just above $900, wondering if I'd need to ask Carol to help pay for my own husband's burial. I did not yet know that within a month, that number would seem almost quaint compared to what was coming, or that grief and disbelief were about to arrive from 2 entirely separate directions for 2 entirely separate reasons. The week after the funeral was when things started shifting, though at the time I never would have used a word as sharp as circling. I would have called it family checking in. It took me longer than it should have to understand the difference between the two. Mark stopped by on a Friday, 4 days after we buried Thomas, and asked, gently at first, whether I'd given any thought to what I wanted to do with Thomas's stake in Bennett Freight. I told him I hadn't given a single thought to anything beyond getting Jack fed and dressed each morning. He nodded, said there was no rush, and then, almost as an afterthought while walking to his truck, mentioned it might be cleanest for everyone if I just signed the shares back to the company at their listed book value, so the business wouldn't get tangled up in probate. I told him I'd think about it. I did not yet understand that book value and real value could be 2 very different numbers, or that the timing of his visit, 4 days after we buried his brother, was not accidental. Carol came by the following Tuesday, carrying a lasagna and a request of her own. She wanted the key to the garage. She said Thomas kept old dispatch records and route paperwork out there that the business would need for its year-end filings, and it would spare everyone a headache if she could take a quick look. I stood in my own kitchen, holding a lasagna dish still warm through the oven mitts, feeling a small, sharp discomfort I couldn't quite name yet. I told her I hadn't been out to the garage myself since Thomas died, that I'd let her know. She smiled the smile I would come to recognize, much later, as her default expression, and told me to take my time, no rush at all, in a tone that suggested the exact opposite. That night, after Jack was asleep, I finally went out to the garage myself for the first time since the funeral. I don't know exactly what I was looking for. Maybe just him. His old work jacket still hung by the door, and I stood there a long time before making myself open the locked filing cabinet where he kept the black laptop. I didn't have a password, so I set it aside, but underneath it, in a plain folder with nothing written on the tab, I found a stack of mail Thomas had apparently been collecting and never opening, bank statements from an institution I didn't recognize, a folded brochure about something called agricultural land conversion, and one certified letter, still sealed, postmarked 5 weeks before he died, from a law firm in Seattle, Washington called Sutton and Vance, attorneys at law. Visible through the return address window was a reference to something called the Cascade Holdings Trust. I sat on the cold garage floor and stared at that envelope for a long time. Thomas had never once, in 9 years, mentioned Seattle. He'd never mentioned a trust. We had never had enough money to need one. I told myself it was probably nothing, a mass mailing, a scam letter dressed up to look personal. I put it in my bag anyway. I couldn't fully explain why, except that some instinct older than reason told me not to leave it sitting around where Carol might come across it first. The following week, I met with an estate attorney for the first time in my life. Her name was Claire Nakamura, and I found her through my sister-in-law's recommendation after her own mother's passing. Claire's office was small and unpretentious, tucked above a bakery in a strip mall not far from our old neighborhood, nothing like the polished marble I'd later come to know existed elsewhere. She was warm but direct, the kind of person who takes notes while you're speaking instead of waiting until after. We went through the basics first. Thomas's will, drafted 7 years earlier, left everything to me in standard, uncomplicated language. Our house carried about $40,000 in equity. A small 401k through Bennett Freight was worth roughly $70,000. A life insurance policy for $150,000 would take 4 to 6 weeks to process, Claire told me gently. It was, she said, a modest but entirely manageable estate. Nothing that would require extensive probate. I remember feeling faintly embarrassed laying those numbers out for her, as though 9 years of careful frugality had somehow amounted to a failure I now had to present for review. Near the end of the appointment, almost as an afterthought, I pulled the certified letter out of my bag and set it on her desk. I told her I'd found it unopened in the garage, that I didn't recognize the firm, that it was probably nothing important. Claire picked it up, turned it over, studied the return address for a long moment, and then looked back at me with an expression I hadn't seen from her yet. Laura, she said carefully, certified mail from an out-of-state law firm referencing something called a trust is not typically nothing. Do you have any working knowledge of what this refers to? I told her I had none whatsoever. She said she strongly recommended I open it, and if it referenced an active legal matter, that I call the number listed that same day, because deadlines on trust and estate matters could be shorter than most people expected. I opened it in my car in Claire's parking lot, engine off, the late September chill fogging the windshield. The letter was brief, formal, and completely disorienting. It stated that the firm of Sutton and Vance represented the trustee of the Cascade Holdings Trust, that Thomas Bennett had been listed as a primary contact and interested party in connection with the trust, and that given recent changes to its status, the firm needed to speak with him at his earliest convenience regarding matters of, in the letter's exact language, significant financial consequence. I sat in that parking lot and read the sentence 4 times. Significant financial consequence. I thought about the air conditioning we never ran. I thought about the bicycle Jack didn't get. I thought about $900 in a joint account and a lasagna dish still cooling on my kitchen counter with Carol's name taped to the bottom. And then, with hands that weren't entirely steady, I dialed the number printed beneath the letterhead. A woman answered on the second ring, identified herself as a paralegal at Sutton and Vance, and asked how she could help. I explained who I was, that I was calling about a certified letter addressed to my husband, that my husband had passed away 4 weeks earlier. There was a pause on the other end, the particular kind of pause that tells you someone is choosing their next words with unusual care. She asked me to hold, and less than a minute later, a man's voice came on the line, calm, measured, and immediately apologetic in a way that made my stomach drop before he'd said a single substantive thing. His name was Gordon Vance. He told me he was very sorry for my loss, and that he needed to ask me to come into the office in person as soon as I reasonably could, that this wasn't a conversation he wanted to have over the phone. I told him I had a 6-year-old in a classroom full of 10th graders, and that Seattle was over 1,000 miles from my kitchen table, and that if there was something he needed to tell me, he could tell me right now. There was another pause. Then he said, "Mrs. Bennett, Your husband was a founding investor and the primary named beneficiary of a trust called Cascade Holdings, currently valued at approximately $61 million. As his surviving spouse and named successor beneficiary, that trust now passes to you, subject to one condition outlined in the trust documents. I have listened to the recording of that call more times than I'd like to admit, because I asked him afterward whether it had been recorded for quality purposes, and he said it had, and he sent it to me. I wanted proof later that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. I remember sitting in my car saying the word 61 out loud alone, to no one, testing whether it sounded real coming out of my own mouth. Gordon explained it slowly, patiently, the way you'd explain something to someone who might faint. Cascade Holdings had begun 16 years earlier, when Thomas was 26, 2 years before he and I even met. He had quietly partnered with a college friend named Nathan Reyes, putting a modest amount of early savings into a data analytics startup Nathan was building out of a rented office in Seattle. Neither of them had significant money at the time, but the company had grown and grown again, and 7 years ago had been acquired by a much larger technology firm in a deal that made both men, on paper, extraordinarily wealthy. Thomas had taken his share and, rather than change one visible thing about our narrow house outside Denver, had rolled nearly all of it into a revocable trust, diversified across index funds, commercial property, and undeveloped land parcels outside Seattle that had appreciated at what Gordon described, with something close to professional awe, as an extraordinary rate. I asked him the only question that mattered to me in that moment, underneath every other question. Why hadn't he told me? Gordon said he couldn't speak to Thomas's personal reasoning, that he was an estate attorney, not a marriage counselor, but that Thomas had been unusually deliberate in how the trust was structured, and that the deliberateness itself might answer more of my question than any conversation could. He said the trust included a sealed letter addressed to me personally, to be opened only in his office, in person, as part of the disclosure process. He said there was, as mentioned, a condition. The condition, he explained, was this. The trust required that I appear in person at his office within 40 days of formal notification to complete identity verification and accept the trust in writing. That much was standard, a safeguard against fraudulent claims common among people who kept significant, private wealth. But Thomas had added a second, unusually specific clause. The trust would be voided, its assets redirected to a designated charitable foundation, if I had signed, or signed within that 40-day window, any agreement releasing claims to, or waiving interest in, Bennett Freight and Logistics, or any Bennett family asset. Gordon read the clause to me twice, so I could write it down. My pen shook slightly against the notepad on my passenger seat. I asked him if that meant what I thought it meant. He said, carefully, that he couldn't offer a legal interpretation of another person's intentions, but that in over 20 years of estate law, he had rarely seen a clause written with that level of specificity unless the person writing it had anticipated exactly the kind of pressure it was designed to prevent. I thought about Mark at my kitchen table 4 days after the funeral, mentioning book value so gently, so reasonably. I thought about Carol wanting the garage key. I felt something shift in my chest, somewhere between fear and a strange, sharpening clarity, the same clarity I would come to rely on more than almost anything else in the months that followed. Gordon booked me an appointment for 10 days later. He told me to bring identification, a certified copy of the death certificate, and anything else Thomas might have left regarding the trust. I thought of the folder in the garage, the bank statements I still hadn't fully read, the brochure about land conversion I'd shoved back into the cabinet without finishing. I told him I'd bring what I had. I hung up and sat in that parking lot for another 20 minutes without moving. Carol's lasagna dish was still on my counter at home. Mark's gentle suggestion about the shares was still sitting, unanswered, on my kitchen table. And somewhere in Seattle, Washington, a dead man's careful, decade-long secret was waiting behind a locked office door, addressed to me, with a condition built specifically, I now understood with growing certainty, to protect me from the very family who had spent the last 2 weeks bringing me lasagna. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed scrolling through old photos of Thomas, staring at his face the way you stare at a familiar word until it stops looking like a word at all. I kept asking the same question in different shapes. Who was this man? Not because I doubted he'd loved me. I never once doubted that. But because I was beginning to understand that love and disclosure aren't the same thing, and that Thomas had decided, long before I ever met him, that I could have all of his devotion and almost none of his history. I called my sister first thing the next morning, sitting on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets, because my legs genuinely didn't want to hold me up while I said the number out loud to another human being for the first time. She went quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. Then she said, very softly, "Laura, honey, are you sitting down?" which made me laugh in the strange, slightly unhinged way you laugh when something is too large to process as anything but absurd. She didn't ask a single question I wasn't ready to answer. She just said, "Whatever you need, I've got Jack. I've got whatever you need." And I believed her, and I have never forgotten it. The next thing I did was request personal leave from school, effective immediately, and then I went back out to the garage, sat on the same cold floor, and this time read every piece of mail in that folder instead of setting it aside. Bank statements from an institution called Evergreen Trust Company confirmed regular quarterly disbursements into an account I didn't recognize, going back nearly 9 years. The brochure detailed land parcels outside a town near Seattle I'd never heard of, purchased 15 years earlier for a fraction of what a handwritten note in the margin, in Thomas's cramped handwriting, estimated they were now worth. And tucked at the very bottom, a slightly bent business card for Nathan Reyes, founder, with a Seattle area code and a company name I now recognized from Gordon's phone call, Brightline Analytics, the company that had been acquired 7 years earlier. I called the number on the card before I'd fully decided to. Nathan Reyes picked up on the third ring, and when I told him who I was, there was a long silence, and then he said quietly, "I wondered when I'd hear from you." He told me he'd learned of Thomas's death from a mutual acquaintance, that he'd wanted to reach out, that he hadn't known what he was allowed to say, that Thomas had asked him years earlier to keep certain things quiet, a request that felt, Nathan admitted, increasingly strange to honor now that Thomas was gone. Nathan, and I talked for almost 2 hours that afternoon, and what he told me rearranged everything I thought I understood about my own marriage. Thomas's father, Nathan explained carefully, had made a series of reckless investments in the trucking company's early years, nearly bankrupting Bennett Freight twice through decisions no one in the family liked to discuss. The second time, to cover the shortfall, Carol had quietly liquidated a small education trust Thomas's grandfather had set aside specifically for his college tuition, without asking him, without even telling him until years afterward, framing it to him as a necessary family sacrifice he should be grateful for rather than a decision he'd had no say in. Thomas had been 18. He took out loans instead, worked nights through college, and never spoke about it as though it had wounded him, though clearly it had, because he spent the rest of his financial life building a fortress specifically designed to ensure it could never happen to him again. When Brightline sold, Nathan said Thomas had been almost eerily calm about the money, far more focused on structuring it so that no one, and Nathan repeated the word, no one, could touch it without his explicit, deliberate consent, than on enjoying a single dollar of it. Nathan had asked him once, half joking, whether he planned to tell his wife. Thomas had gone quiet in a way Nathan described as unlike him, and said only, "When the timing's right, when I've got the door built." Nathan hadn't fully understood what that meant at the time. He understood more now. In the 1.5 years before Thomas died, he had quietly started researching relocation, private schools near Seattle, and a full withdrawal of his name from Bennett Freight's ownership structure. And Nathan added, almost as an afterthought that landed on me like a stone, Thomas had discreetly covered 2 shortfalls at his brother Mark's request that he strongly suspected were gambling debts, the same pattern repeating itself a generation later, quietly, invisibly, the way patterns do in families that never learned how to speak about the thing actually happening. Thomas had been building a door out. He simply hadn't opened it yet. I sat with that for a long time after Nathan and I hung up. Not anger exactly, though there was some of that too, tangled up with something closer to grief for a version of my husband I never fully got to meet, a man who had spent 16 years quietly protecting a fortune and a family wound he'd never once let me see the shape of. I thought about the air conditioning we never ran. I thought about Jack's bicycle. And I thought about Gordon Vance's voice explaining a clause built specifically to keep the Bennetts from getting near the one thing Thomas had ever managed to keep entirely, permanently his own. I booked a flight to Seattle for 2 days later. Before I left, I made one more stop at Claire's office to make absolutely certain that in the 10 days since Mark's gentle suggestion about the shares, I had signed nothing, agreed to nothing, and given the Bennett family no foothold at all. Claire confirmed what I already suspected. I hadn't signed a thing, not even the informal text Mark had sent outlining next steps for the shares, which I had left unanswered out of grief rather than strategy, and which now, in hindsight, felt like the first small piece of luck I'd had in weeks. Claire read the trust condition Gordon had described over the phone and went very still. "This wasn't written by someone who trusted his family," she said quietly. "This was written by someone protecting you from them, specifically, deliberately, years in advance." She advised me not to mention the trust to Carol or Mark under any circumstances until it was formally, legally mine. Not a hint, not a number, nothing. "Once they know what's at stake," she said, "the tone of every conversation you have with them is going to change. Let it stay unchanged as long as you possibly can." I tried. I genuinely tried. But Carol, it turned out, didn't need the number to sense that something had shifted. She showed up the evening before my flight, unannounced, the way she always seemed to arrive exactly when I least wanted company. She said she'd heard from a neighbor who knew someone at the school district that I'd taken sudden leave, and she wanted to make sure everything was all right, wanted to know if there was something going on she should know about. I told her I had some personal matters to handle out of state, nothing more. She studied my face the way you study a blueprint for a flaw you already suspect exists, then pivoted, smoothly, into the topic she'd actually come to discuss. She said she and Mark had been talking, and that given how hard this was on everyone, it might be a relief to have the business matters settled quickly, cleanly, so I could focus on grieving and on Jack instead of paperwork. She had, she said, brought a document with her, something Mark's attorney had drawn up, a simple release regarding the Bennett Freight shares, nothing complicated, just tidying up loose ends. She set it on my kitchen table, the same table where Mark had mentioned book value 10 days earlier, and slid a pen across it with a gentleness that, for the first time in 9 years of knowing this woman, I recognized as performance rather than instinct. I told her I wasn't ready to sign anything yet, that my attorney had advised me to take my time with the estate. Something in Carol's face tightened, almost imperceptibly, the mask holding but the seams showing. She said, in a voice that had lost some of its warmth, that she hoped I understood how important family unity was right now, especially for a little boy who needed stability, needed to know his grandmother and uncle were still part of his life, still supporting him the way a family should. She said it lightly, the way you say something you've rehearsed, and I felt the hair rise on my arms, because I recognized, suddenly and completely, exactly where Thomas had learned that particular skill, and exactly why he'd spent 16 years building walls against the people who taught it to him. I told her, as evenly as I could manage, that Jack's stability wasn't in question, and that I wasn't going to sign anything before I'd had time to fully understand my husband's affairs. Carol's expression cooled the rest of the way, all at once, like a light switching off. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Laura," she said, standing, gathering the unsigned document back into her purse with brisk, efficient movements. Thomas would have wanted this handled with grace. I did not tell her that I now had reason to believe Thomas would have wanted almost the exact opposite, that he'd spent a fortune's worth of careful, quiet planning making sure Grace, as she defined it, was never going to be an option available to her again. She left without the lasagna-ish pretense this time, without the softness, and I stood in my kitchen a long while afterward, watching her car pull out of the driveway, feeling the particular cold that comes from realizing a mask has finally, fully come off, even if only for a few seconds, even if it would go right back on the next time we spoke. Mark called that night, an hour after Carol left, his tone entirely different from his gentle driveway request 10 days earlier. He said he'd heard I was refusing to cooperate, said the business had obligations, contracts, drivers who depended on Bennett Freight for their livelihoods, and that he needed me to understand the shares weren't mine to hold on to indefinitely out of, he actually used this word, sentimentality. I told him I'd have my attorney reach out to his attorney, and hung up before he could say anything else. My hands were shaking again, but not, I noticed, from fear this time. From something closer to resolve settling into place, brick by brick, the same way I imagined Thomas had built his own fortress, one deliberate decision at a time. I flew to Seattle the next morning. My sister drove me to the airport before sunrise, Jack still asleep in his car seat in the back, and as she pulled up to departure she reached over and squeezed my hand once hard and said, "Whatever you find out there, you're going to be all right. You were always going to be all right, Laura. You just didn't know it yet." I held on to that sentence the entire flight, turning it over the way you turn over a stone you're not sure you're allowed to keep, somewhere over Wyoming, somewhere over Idaho, all the way down into a city I had never once, in 9 years of marriage, imagined I would need to visit to finally understand who my husband really was. Sutton and Vance occupied the 32nd floor of a glass tower downtown, with windows looking out over water I didn't yet know the name of, in a city that felt, after Denver, almost aggressively vertical. Gordon Vance met me in the lobby himself, a tall, unhurried man in his 60s with the particular manner of someone who has delivered enormous news to grieving spouses more than once and has learned exactly how much silence to leave between sentences. He walked me to a conference room, offered water I didn't drink, and set a thick folder on the table between us. The process took most of the day. Identity verification, certified copies of the death certificate, notarized signatures across nearly a dozen documents I read as carefully as my scattered attention allowed. Gordon walked me through the trust's actual holdings with a patience I will never forget. Roughly $24 million in diversified index funds and bonds, nearly $28 million in appreciated land parcels outside Seattle, now zoned for mixed-use development that several firms were reportedly circling, and the remainder split across a handful of smaller private investments Nathan had helped Thomas make over the years. $61,200,000 and some $1,000, to the exact figure. I wrote it down on a legal pad the way you write down something you're afraid of forgetting, or afraid of believing. I still don't know which. Near the end of the appointment, Gordon opened a drawer and removed a sealed envelope, cream-colored, my name written across the front in Thomas's unmistakable, cramped handwriting, the same handwriting from years of grocery lists and Jack's homework notes. He told me Thomas had delivered it in person nearly 4 years earlier, with strict instructions that it be given to me only if, and when I came to formally accept the trust, and only by Gordon himself, in this office, not mailed, not emailed, not handed off through anyone else. He left the room to give me privacy. I sat alone at that conference table a long moment before I opened it. The letter was 3 pages, and I have read it more times now than I can count, but I remember the first reading the way you remember the exact temperature of water you've been dropped into. Thomas wrote that if I was reading this, it meant he was gone, and that he was more sorry than he knew how to say in the tidy language of a legal document. He wrote about his father, about the reckless investments, about the tuition trust his grandfather had left him and how his mother had liquidated it without asking, dressed up as sacrifice, and how he had promised himself at 18, alone in a dorm room doing math on tuition he couldn't afford, that he would never again let anyone, family included, decide what happened to money that was his to protect. He wrote that he had built Cascade in silence not because he didn't trust me, but because he had never once, in his whole life, watched money stay safe once his family knew it existed, and he had been terrified, genuinely terrified, that if Carol or Mark ever sensed real wealth anywhere near our household, they would find a way to bleed it slowly, the way they bled the trucking company twice already, the way Mark's private debts were already quietly bleeding it a third time. He wrote that he had been building an exit for us for nearly 2 years, a life near Seattle, distance from his family, a future where Jack could ask for a bicycle and simply get one, and that he was almost ready to tell me everything, that he had, in fact, booked a weekend away for the two of us, alone, no Jack, no family, specifically to finally sit me down and explain, and that the trip was scheduled for 3 weeks after the date he actually died. I sat with that sentence for a long time. 3 weeks. He had been 3 weeks away from telling me everything himself, in his own words, on his own timeline, the way he'd always insisted on doing things. Instead, an aneurysm at his desk had handed the truth to a stranger's careful legal language and a locked cabinet in our garage. The last lines of the letter asked me to forgive him for the silence, and asked me, more urgently, to protect what he'd built from the people it was built to be protected from. He wrote that he loved me more than 9 years of careful frugality had ever let him show, and that the unused air conditioning and the modest birthdays had never once been about the money not existing. They had been about him keeping a promise to an 18-year-old version of himself who had sworn no one would ever again touch what was his to give away only when and only to whom he chose. I cried in that conference room in a way I hadn't let myself cry since the hospital hallway, and when Gordon came back in 10 minutes later, he simply sat down across from me and waited, without a single word, until I was ready to keep going. I signed the final acceptance documents that afternoon with a steadiness that surprised me. Before I left, Gordon mentioned, almost in passing, that his office had received a call 2 days earlier from an attorney identifying himself as representing the Bennett family, asking general questions about the disposition of Thomas Bennett's outside assets. Gordon had told them, correctly, that he wasn't at liberty to discuss another client's private trust matters with unrelated third parties, but he wanted me to know the inquiry had happened, that someone back home already suspected there was more to find than a modest life insurance policy and a small 401k. My flight home was the next morning. I landed in Denver to a voicemail from Mark, timestamped while I was still in the air, that I listened to standing at baggage claim with my suitcase circling, unclaimed, on the carousel behind me. His voice was tight, clipped, entirely unlike the gentle brother-in-law who'd once mentioned book value so softly across my own kitchen table. "Laura," it said, "we need to talk. Today. Before you do anything else." I did not call Mark back. I called Claire instead, from the airport parking garage, and read her the voicemail word for word. She was quiet a moment, then said what I was already beginning to understand myself. "They know," she said, "or they know enough. The clock just started on something, and we need to be ready before they are." She told me to document everything from that point forward, every call, every visit, every email, and to route all future Bennett family contact through her office exclusively, starting immediately. It took 5 days for the first formal move to arrive. A letter from an attorney representing Carol and Mark, alleging that Thomas had not been of sound mind or full disclosure capacity regarding significant assets at the time certain trust documents were finalized, and requesting a formal accounting of the Cascade Holdings Trust on the grounds that undisclosed family assets, specifically referencing early investment capital they claimed had originated in part from Bennett Freight's operating funds nearly 2 decades earlier, might entitle the Family business to a claim against the trust. Claire read it twice, set it down, and said one word. Interesting. She explained this was essentially a shot across the bow, an attempt to freeze or complicate the trust through a contest, filed not because it had strong legal footing, but because litigation itself is expensive and exhausting, and exhausted people sign things they wouldn't otherwise sign. I was not, by that point, an exhausted person willing to sign things. I was something else entirely, something that had been quietly assembling itself since a cold garage floor and a certified letter 5 weeks earlier. Claire filed discovery requests within the week, and what came back over the following month confirmed almost everything Nathan had told me over the phone, this time in documents instead of memory. Bank records subpoenaed from Bennett Freight's accounts showed no operating funds had ever flowed into Cascade. The 16-year-old investment had come entirely from Thomas's personal savings and a modest signing bonus from his first job out of college, exactly as Nathan described. Far more damaging to Mark and Carol's position, however, were records Claire's investigator uncovered almost by accident while tracing the family's financial history to establish context for separate transfers from Thomas's personal accounts to Mark over the previous 3 years, totaling just under $180,000, each one immediately preceded by a cash withdrawal from Mark's own accounts at a casino outside the city. Thomas had not just been quietly protecting his fortune from his family. He had been quietly, privately absorbing his brother's gambling losses for years, the exact pattern his father had set a generation earlier, repeating itself in a new decade with a new name attached, and Thomas, it turned out, had known about all of it the entire time. Claire also tracked down the original trust documentation from Thomas's grandfather, the one Carol had liquidated when Thomas was 18. It still existed, buried in an old probate file from 2 decades earlier, showing a clear, unambiguous designation naming Thomas as sole beneficiary of an education trust that had been dissolved 4 months before his freshman year of college, with the proceeds transferred, per Carol's signature as then guardian of the account, directly into Bennett Freight's operating fund. It was legal. Carol had been within her rights as guardian. But it was also laid out in black and white beside Carol's current claim that the family deserved a share of Thomas's private wealth, almost unbearably clarifying. She had taken from him once, quietly, and called it sacrifice. Now she wanted to do it again and call it fairness. The pressure campaign, meanwhile, did not stop. Carol called my school twice, identifying herself to the front office as Jack's grandmother, asking vague questions about my state of mind, and whether the district had any concerns about my capacity to care for him alone, questions the vice principal, thankfully, found strange enough to mention to me directly rather than simply answer. A woman I didn't recognize left a voicemail on my personal cell suggesting, in careful, deniable language, that public records regarding family disputes tended to follow people professionally, and that it might be wiser to settle quietly before things became complicated for a teacher who worked with other people's children. I recorded that call. Colorado allows one-party consent. Claire confirmed within the hour, and she filed a harassment motion this same week, attaching the recording, the school inquiry, and a timeline of contact that made the pattern impossible to dismiss as coincidence. The mediation Mark's attorney proposed 6 weeks later offered a settlement that, on its surface, sounded almost generous. The family would drop the contest entirely in exchange for a lump sum gift from the trust and my agreement to keep the entire dispute, including the source of the money and the reasons behind it, permanently confidential. Claire called it exactly what it was the moment she finished reading it. "They're not trying to get money from you anymore," she said. "They're trying to buy your silence about why Thomas hid it from them in the first place." I thought about the letter in my nightstand drawer, about an 18-year-old doing tuition math alone in a dorm room, about a fortress built one deliberate decision at a time by a man who never got the chance to explain it to me himself. I told Claire to decline. No counteroffer. Full accounting, full disclosure, and let a judge see every document we had. We never made it to trial. 3 weeks after we declined the settlement, facing a mounting record of documented harassment, a contest built on a bank funding theory their own accounts disproved, and a judge who had already signaled sharp skepticism at a preliminary hearing, Mark and Carol withdrew the contest entirely. Claire called to tell me on a Thursday afternoon while I was standing in Jack's classroom doorway waiting to pick him up, and I remember having to sit down on one of the tiny elementary chairs, my knees nearly at my ears, while she read me the filing over the phone. Thomas's letter had asked me to protect what he'd built. I had done it. It had taken 5 months, 3 attorneys, and more courage than I knew I had, but I had done exactly what he never got the chance to do himself. The first disbursement from Cascade Holdings hit my account on a Monday morning in March, 5.5 months after Thomas died. I was standing in my kitchen making Jack's lunch, the same kitchen with the same dented gutter Thomas never got around to replacing, and I stared at the number on my phone screen for so long that Jack asked me, with the particular seriousness only a 6-year-old can manage, whether I was okay. I told him I was better than okay. I didn't yet know how to explain the rest of it to him, not in a way a first grader could hold on to, so I just picked him up, both of us still in pajamas, and spun him around the kitchen until he was laughing too hard to ask any more questions. I didn't move to Seattle, in the end, though I thought about it for a while. Thomas's unfinished plan had been built for a version of our life that ended before it could begin, and I decided, somewhere in that long, strange winter, that I wanted to build my own version instead of finishing someone else's, even someone I'd loved as completely as I loved him. I stayed in Denver. I bought a different house, 6 months later, in a neighborhood with better schools and no memories waiting behind every door, with a thermostat I now keep exactly wherever Jack and I feel like keeping it. I kept teaching for another year, not because I needed the paycheck anymore, but because I wasn't ready to stop being Mrs. Bennett to a classroom full of teenagers who had no idea their biology teacher could have bought the entire school building if she'd wanted to. I resigned eventually, not out of restlessness, but because I started something new, a small foundation, funded modestly out of the trust that provides emergency tuition grants to kids whose families hit exactly the kind of financial wall 18-year-old Thomas hit alone in a dorm room, doing math on numbers that had been taken from him without his consent. I named it, with Nathan Reyes's blessing and a fair amount of both our tears, the Cascade Fund. It felt like the truest way to keep Thomas's promise to himself, extended outward, to strangers he never got the chance to help directly. Carol and Mark I have not spoken to since the contest was withdrawn, aside from the custody-adjacent civility required for Jack's sake around occasional holidays, arranged carefully through attorneys rather than lasagna. Bennett Freight and Logistics, I heard through my sister, who still has friends who have friends, struggled through a difficult year after the ownership dispute became impossible to keep quiet in a community our size, and Mark, I'm told, eventually sought help for the gambling, which I found I was able to feel something almost like relief about, even after everything, because Thomas, I think, would have wanted that more than he ever wanted an apology aimed at me. Nathan Reyes flew out for Jack's 7th birthday, 7 months after that Monday morning in my kitchen, and brought with him a box of old photographs I'd never seen. Thomas at 26, thin and serious and impossibly young, standing outside a rented office space in Seattle with Nathan's arm slung over his shoulder, both of them grinning at a future neither could have accurately predicted. Nathan told me things about Thomas's 20s I'd never known, stories from a decade before I existed in his life, and I sat on my back porch that evening after Jack had gone to bed, looking through those photographs, and felt something settle in me that I don't think I'd fully had until that moment. Not closure, exactly. Something steadier than that. Something closer to completion. I still have the letter. It lives in a fireproof box in my closet now, not a nightstand drawer, and I read it every year on the anniversary of the day I opened it in Gordon Vance's conference room, sitting alone at that long table with water outside the window I still don't know the name of. I used to think Thomas's silence was the thing that defined our marriage's last chapter, the secret that outweighed everything that came before it. I don't think that anymore. I think the silence was a scar from something that happened to him decades before we ever met, and I think, in his own careful, imperfect, maddeningly indirect way, he spent 16 years trying to make sure that scar never became mine to carry, or Jack's. He didn't get to finish the job the way he wanted to, but he built the walls strong enough that I could finish it for him. Jack is 7 now, asking increasingly complicated questions about his father that I answer as honestly as a 7-year-old can absorb. A little more of the truth added each year. The way you build something slowly, deliberately, one honest layer at a time. He has a bicycle with gears. He has, in fact, 3 bicycles, one of which he's already outgrown and refuses to let me donate, because it was, he informed me solemnly last spring, the first one Dad would have wanted me to have. I didn't correct him. Some truths don't need correcting. They just need room to grow into themselves. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, Jack asks why his father worked so much when we clearly, now, didn't need the money. I've learned to answer that question in pieces, a little at a time, so it doesn't overwhelm him. I tell him his father was protecting something important, and that people who love us sometimes make choices we don't understand until much later, if ever. I tell him it's all right to feel angry about the silence and grateful for the walls in the same breath, because I have felt both myself, often within minutes of each other. He usually nods, the way children do when filing something away to ask about again in a year or two. Older, ready for a little more truth than the version I gave him this time. If this story taught me anything, it's this. The people who love us don't always show us the whole shape of themselves, and sometimes the silence isn't about what they're hiding from you, it's about what they're trying to protect you from, even when they get the method wrong, even when it costs both of you more than it should have. I wish Thomas had trusted me with his fortress while he was still alive to walk me through it himself. I understand now, in the deepest and most complicated way I know how, exactly why he built it in the first place. Thank you for listening to this story with me here on Kate's Fortune Stories. If Laura's story moved you, if you found yourself wondering what you would do sitting on that cold garage floor, staring at a certified letter you never expected to open, let me know in the comments. I read every single one, and I always love hearing which of these stories stays with you the longest. And if you haven't yet, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. It truly helps the story find the people who need to hear it. Tell me in the comments what city you're watching from, because I love seeing just how far these stories travel. Don't forget to subscribe, because there's always another story waiting. Thank you for being here with me. I'll see you in the next one.